It was the morning of Friday, July 10, 2020. Baron Lee got up early to go to work. He normally didn't work Fridays because he used that day to hand off his son Eric to his ex-wife. It was their custody exchange day. For that reason, he usually took the whole day off to spend quality time with his family. However, on that particular Friday, a colleague was on leave, so Baron had to cover his shift. Everyone woke up early. Around 7 a.m. they made breakfast, turned on the TV, played some music, and spent time together, enjoying the morning. Sadly, Baron had to leave. He put on his suit, kissed his wife and 3 children goodbye, and at 8:30, he stepped out the door. In his left hand, he held a briefcase, in his right, the car keys. His vehicle was parked just outside. He walked out calmly, confidently, and relaxed. And then, suddenly, he heard what sounded like firecrackers. It had just been the 4th of July, so the noise didn't strike him as unusual. People were still setting them off. But when he turned around, he realized they weren't firecrackers. They were gunshots, and they were aimed at him. I heard a loud pop. I thought it was fireworks. I looked to my left, nothing. I looked to the right, and then the second shot rang out and hit me in the arm. Everything happened so fast. The shooter was thin, had his face covered, wore a white t-shirt, and was moving quickly and nervously toward him. Baron had to think fast, dodge, hide, survive. With his right hand, he opened the car door, and at that moment, another bullet struck him in the arm. In pain, he dropped his keys, but there was no time to stop. Using his left hand, Baron managed to open the car door. At that moment, the gunman shot him in the back of his right leg, bringing him to the ground. He collapsed to his knees, struggling to get back up, and in the midst of that desperate attempt, he looked up, only to be shot directly in the chest. With what little strength he had left, he managed to crawl into the car. Once inside, the shooter continued firing, striking him in the hip, the left arm, and the left leg. The gunman didn't stop until he ran out of bullets. Then, calmly, he collected the shell casings and disappeared, believing Baron Lee was dead. Several neighbors had already called 911, and an ambulance arrived almost immediately. He was rushed to the hospital and taken into surgery, and, miraculously, he survived. And I do mean miraculously, because no one could believe it. Baron had been shot 9 times. Multiple surgeries followed. The first operation focused on removing the bullets and closing the wounds. Even so, 3 bullets remained lodged inside his body. Subsequent surgeries targeted his right arm, which had been completely shattered, and eventually, he also had to undergo a hip replacement. But the story doesn't end there. Although Baron survived, a gunman was still at large, so police had to act swiftly. Baron Lee was born in July 1972 in Thailand. There's no available information about his parents or whether he had siblings. What we do know about his childhood, however, is deeply disturbing. When he was just a year old, his family moved to Hawaii. From the outside, it seemed like a picture-perfect environment, but Baron's reality was far from idyllic. 2 years later, neighbors contacted the police after hearing the toddler screaming endlessly. He had been crying for days, and no one appeared to be responding. Fearing the worst, the neighbors called for help. When police arrived, they forced their way into the home and found the little boy inside the bathtub, his body covered in burns. At that moment, he was barely conscious, weak, and nearly lifeless. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. Doctors discovered that his burns had been inflicted using a clothing iron. Even more horrifying, his parents were allegedly the perpetrators. As expected, they lost custody. Over the next 17 years, Baron passed through 17 different foster homes. His childhood and adolescence were marked by chaos, instability, and trauma. He never had a safe home, a stable family, or consistent access to education. As he reached his teenage years, he began cycling in and out of juvenile detention centers. He was lost, uncertain about his future, and had no idea what the next day would bring. But one thing he did know, he didn't want to continue living like this. In 1994, at the age of 22, Barron made a decision. It had to stop. He wanted a decent job, a better life, a clean slate. He wanted to rebuild himself completely, and he knew he couldn't do that in Hawaii. That's when Barron made a drastic decision. He chose to invest his few remaining savings into a one-way plane ticket to Las Vegas. Everyone around him thought he'd lost his mind, that it wouldn't work, that he'd be back home in no time. But against all odds, it worked. Upon arriving in Las Vegas, Barron found a job as a croupier and managed to secure lodging at the California Hotel. He began earning a decent income, saving money, and making friends and connections. Over time, he landed a better job. For the first time in his life, he was starting fresh, far from chaos, pain, and trauma. He was happy. He was doing what he loved. In 2001, Barron met someone who would become his best friend, Dee. Like him, Dee was Thai. However, her life had followed a completely different path. She had recently graduated from a Canadian university and had moved to Las Vegas with her mother. When Dee and Barron met, they instantly connected and quickly became inseparable. In time, Dee married and had 2 children, Sophie and Ian. Barron also fell in love. He met the woman of his dreams, got married, and they had a child together. He finally had everything he'd ever wished for. But of course, this story was far from over, it was just beginning. In late 2008, Barron began registering on several online dating sites, hoping to find love. He tried one site, then another, but nothing seemed to work, until he met someone he believed was the one. Sharon Rose Kelly. Sharon was from Washington State and about 10 years younger than Barron. But the age difference didn't matter. They clicked right away, felt instant chemistry, and in January 2009, Sharon traveled to Las Vegas to meet him in person. Their connection only deepened. They were smitten with each other, and just a few months later, Sharon made a life-changing decision. She left everything behind in Washington and moved in with Barron. In October 2010, they got married. From the outside, the couple seemed to be living a dream. Everything looked perfect, happy, harmonious, idyllic. In January 2011, they packed their things and moved to Washington, where Sharon's family lived. It's important to note something here. According to several sources, Sharon had a volatile and unpredictable personality. She was also described as demanding and prone to mood swings. But for Barron, that wasn't a problem. He actually liked that about her. He was drawn to her fiery, uncontrollable spirit. It was part of what he loved most. In 2014, the couple welcomed their first child, Eric Dragon Lee. During the pregnancy, Sharon had several issues with her gynecologist, leading to conflicts and disagreements. Out of pride, she decided she would not give birth at that hospital. Instead, she made arrangements to deliver at a maternity center. The delivery went smoothly. It was quick and without complications. The baby was tested as part of standard postnatal care. Blood samples were taken to check for any genetic or medical conditions. While they waited for the results, Sharon and Barron brought their newborn home, relaxed and hopeful. But just a few days later, Eric began to look unwell. His skin had turned a yellowish-orange hue. Deeply concerned, they called the maternity center and described what was happening. The staff reassured them, it was probably just mild jaundice, they said. Nothing serious. They advised indirect sunlight exposure and said he should recover soon. Unfortunately, things didn't improve. And so, the couple decided to take Eric too. They rushed Eric to the hospital, only to receive devastating news. The baby was in a far worse condition than anyone had imagined. The advice they had received from the maternity center had been dangerously wrong. Eric was suffering from severe hyperglycemia. Back when he was born, the center had taken blood samples as required. But in a shocking act of negligence, those samples were never analyzed. The nurse responsible had left them in her car. Had they been properly tested, doctors would have discovered that Eric had a serious, inherited metabolic disorder called galactosemia, caused by an enzyme deficiency. If this had been diagnosed from day one, they would have known that Eric could not be fed breast milk. But for days, 2, 3, up to 8, he had been nursing, unknowingly poisoning his tiny body. The damage was already done, severe and irreversible. Doctors were able to save his life, but the cost was immense. Eric had suffered serious brain damage. He would never be able to walk, speak, or communicate. On top of that, he developed chronic intestinal issues and would require lifelong, specialized care, strict diets, continuous medication, 24/7 monitoring, and constant supervision. But the family's troubles didn't end there. Sharon couldn't cope. She was diagnosed with postpartum depression. Her mind was clouded, she was overwhelmed, unable to process what was happening or make decisions. Everything felt too heavy, too much. She simply shut down. So Baron stepped up. He took full responsibility, dedicating himself entirely to Eric's care. But he wasn't just going to care for his son, he wanted justice. What had happened was not an accident, it was medical negligence, and someone had to be held accountable. He filed a lawsuit against the maternity center. He fought hard and eventually settled, $650,000 in compensation. And now you might be wondering, what did he do with the money? Did he keep it for himself? Not. Baron created a trust fund for Eric. The child's care was expensive, and Baron feared that one day, if he or Sharon were no longer around, Eric wouldn't survive on his own. So every cent of that money was placed in the trust, exclusively for Eric. Neither Baron nor Sharon could touch it. There was, however, one small clause that raised eyebrows. If Eric were to pass away before the age of 30, the beneficiaries could then access the funds. But for Baron, this was just a legal formality. He didn't dwell on it. What mattered to him was that his son would always be protected, no matter what happened. That was his only concern. As time passed, the situation at home became more difficult. Between Eric's condition and Sharon's depression, life was anything but easy. Baron was completely devoted. He managed Eric's medication, appointments, feedings, therapies, everything. Meanwhile, Sharon remained distant. Deeply affected by what had happened, she was unable to take part in her son's care. Baron never judged her. He understood. He gave her space and time. But as the months turned into years, Sharon never came back to herself. She didn't improve, didn't engage. And eventually, Baron discovered something that would change everything. She was cheating on him. And that was the final straw. In 2015, Baron made the hardest but wisest decision of his life: to end things with Sharon and fight for full custody of Eric. She wasn't fit to be a mother. She hadn't been there emotionally, mentally, or physically. That day, as usual, Baron finished his shift at work and returned home. But this time, he was determined. He confronted her. He told her he was tired. Tired of her absence, of her lack of involvement, of her betrayal. And with that, he packed his bags, took Eric in his arms, and told Sharon he was leaving, with the child. But just as he reached the door, Sharon snapped. What followed was a nightmare. She began screaming, hysterical, and grabbed Eric's tiny arm, trying to wrench him away from Baron. She didn't care if she hurt him. She just wanted control. For a few terrifying seconds, there was a tug of war between his arms and hers. Baron, fearing that Eric might get hurt or traumatized, gently placed the child on the floor and backed away. That's when the neighbors, alarmed by the shouting, called the police. Officers arrived quickly and asked what had happened. That's when Sharon lied. She told them Baron had attacked her, that he had hit both her and the child, that he had smashed a chair in a fit of rage and torn the house apart. But none of it was true. The apartment was spotless. Not a scratch on Sharon. Nothing was broken. Still, she kept repeating that Baron was violent and dangerous, tears streaming down her face, her voice frantic. The officers, naturally, focused on calming her down. And in the chaos, while no one was looking, she took Eric in her arms, and left. One of the officers quietly pulled Baron aside. He warned him, during the divorce, stay away from her. These false accusations could escalate. She might try to frame you for abuse. Baron nodded. He understood. He headed straight to the police, filed a report, and then called a locksmith. He changed every lock in the house. Just 2 hours later, Sharon returned, with 2 of her friends. She tried to open the door with her key but couldn't. Frustrated, she called the police again. When the officers arrived and asked what was going on, Sharon lied once more. This time, she accused Baron of posting intimate photos of her on Facebook. Baron was stunned. He denied everything, he hadn't posted anything like that. But Sharon insisted. She claimed a friend had seen the pictures. That they were public. That he had humiliated her. Baron asked, what friend? What exactly did she see? Suddenly, Sharon couldn't answer. She didn't know which friend. She stammered, then said the pictures had been deleted already. The police listened to both sides. They told Baron that since the house was also under Sharon's name, he couldn't change the locks without her consent. Their suggestion? That the 2 of them live separately, at least for now, until the legal process sorted things out. During the divorce proceedings, it was strongly recommended that the couple maintain distance to avoid conflicts or confrontations that could negatively impact the child. Following this advice, both Baron and Sharon separated. However, just 2 weeks later, Sharon made a bold and strategic move. She went to the police station and filed a complaint. She requested a restraining order against Baron, as well as a protective custody order, claiming that he was dangerous, violent towards both her and the child, and incapable of providing proper care. Until the investigation was completed, Baron was evicted from the home. Authorities came to remove him, allowing him to pack only a small bag. At that point, the only possession he retained was his car. While he could challenge the situation later in court, in the meantime, Sharon remained in the house with the child. For 2 weeks, Baron lived out of his vehicle. When the court date finally arrived, he contested the allegations. That's when he discovered Sharon had executed a brilliant maneuver. She now had stable housing, while he only had a car. She claimed she possessed all the necessary resources, a safe home, the means to support the child, and the capacity to provide protection. She presented herself as the ideal candidate for full custody and even alleged that she feared Eric might die in her ex-husband's care due to his supposed incompetence. Although the judge found no evidence to support the claims of violence and lifted the restraining order, custody was nonetheless awarded to Sharon. Baron was ordered to pay $6,000 per month in child support and medical expenses, a staggering amount for someone with an ordinary job. At the time, he worked as a car salesman. While he earned a decent income, it was nowhere near enough to consistently afford such a sum. Perhaps he could manage a payment or two by tapping into his savings. But the financial strain quickly became unsustainable. To make matters worse, his visitation rights were severely limited, only twice a week, for 2 hours each time. And even then, he wasn't allowed to be alone with the child. A supervisor had to be present. During the first supervised visit, the observer was astonished by how attentive and capable Barron was. He managed everything perfectly, administering medication, providing care, showing deep affection. His love for his son was undeniable. And he clearly knew what he was doing. According to some sources, Sharon overheard the supervisor say they would report positively to the judge. From that point forward, she began to create obstacles at every turn. Despite Barron's relentless efforts, finding a new home, fighting for unsupervised visits, Sharon did everything she could to sabotage his progress. She caused scenes, screamed during exchanges, and on one occasion, allegedly attempted to run him over. Barron claims he even ended up on the hood of her car. As time went on, the situation only grew worse. During the period in which Sharon had custody, Eric was hospitalized 5 times, 5 separate occasions where he required medical admission. Naturally, Barron went to the hospital to check on his son, to understand what was happening. But each time Sharon saw him, she would alert security and loudly claim that he was under a restraining order and legally barred from being there. Barron desperately sought help. He reached out to social workers, advocates, anyone who might support him. Still, every visit to the hospital turned into a nightmare, with Sharon creating scenes that made life unbearable. It was a relentless torment, a constant state of anguish. Unfortunately, the situation eventually reached a breaking point. As expected, Barron was unable to keep up with the $6,000 monthly child support payments. He simply didn't earn that kind of money and had no savings substantial enough to sustain such an obligation. This led to a growing debt, estimated between $12,000 and $144,000. As a result, the justice system threatened him with incarceration. Barron realized that if he ended up in prison, he would lose all ability to protect or reclaim his son. His hands would be completely tied. Faced with no other choice, he packed his belongings and temporarily fled to Las Vegas. The decision to move wasn't entirely his own. It was actually suggested by his best friend, Dee. Remaining in Washington meant facing arrest and imprisonment, making it impossible for him to continue fighting for his son. Staying was futile, so he left, relocating to Dee's home in Las Vegas, where she lived with her 2 children. At that point, Dee was also divorced. They began talking, planning, reflecting on what to do next. Slowly, their bond deepened and eventually blossomed into love. Sometime later, they married. Barron was no longer alone in his battle. Together, they strategized their next steps, hoping that eventually Sharon would make a mistake, and when she did, they would return to Washington and seek full custody. Dee was fully committed to this plan, and her children supported the move as well. The long-awaited opportunity finally arrived in May 2017, when social services contacted Barron with stunning news: his son had been placed in foster care. What led to that point was chilling. Apparently, Sharon had hired a home nurse to care for Eric. This nurse took full responsibility, monitoring him, providing medication, and overseeing his well-being. One day, she noticed Eric was in very poor condition. She immediately notified Sharon, who, shockingly, dismissed the concern. The nurse, alarmed, called an ambulance. At the hospital, a disturbing pattern came to light. Previously, at another hospital, Sharon had issued instructions that her son was not to be resuscitated, and had also demanded an unnecessary tracheotomy. Now, at this second hospital, she made the same requests. The medical team grew suspicious. 2 hospitals, 2 identical disturbing orders. They reported the case to social services, who, upon reviewing the evidence, swiftly removed custody from Sharon and placed Eric in foster care. Authorities then contacted Barron and asked if he would assume care of his son. Without hesitation, he said yes. He and his wife packed their things, took the children, and returned to Washington. They did everything for Eric, eventually purchasing a lovely home in Bellevue. And after long, in May of 2019, Barron finally regained custody of his son. Additionally, the child support payments were reduced from $6,000 to $800 per month. Despite this, Sharon was still allowed to see Eric on weekends, at least until March of 2020, when something happened during one of these visits that led the judge to revoke her visitation rights. Initially, she could visit without supervision, but an incident forced the visits to be monitored, a change that Sharon was clearly not pleased with. This brings us to Friday, July 10, 2020. By this point, Barron's life had completely changed. He owned a beautiful house in an idyllic neighborhood, was married, and had 3 children. Life seemed perfect. That morning, at 8:30 a.m., as he left for work, a masked assailant opened fire on him. He was shot 9 times, and it remains a mystery how he survived the attack. Afterward, Barron spoke with the police, telling them that he knew who was behind the shooting. The shooter himself didn't know who he was targeting. He was a young, slender man, but Barron was certain that Sharon was behind it all. For Barron, it wasn't just the shooting itself that disturbed him. It was the fact that Sharon had wanted him dead for so long. She had attempted to kill him several times before, but failed. Now, she wanted him and his son both dead. In her mind, it all made sense. She wanted the money from the trust, and if she couldn't get it any other way, she'd eliminate both him and their child. My son could have died. That's what people don't understand, Barron reflected. They all see a shooting. A woman upset with her ex-husband, but I wasn't the target. My son always was. The real question was, who had pulled the trigger, and what was their connection to Sharon? Barron and his family lived in a picturesque area in Bellevue, quaint, semi-detached houses in a secluded yet well-connected neighborhood. Their home was surrounded by trees and greenery, perfect for walks. Through a tunnel, it was easy to reach a nearby shopping center and parking lot. According to a witness, the shooter fled through that tunnel, and the police began their investigation. They brought in tracking dogs, combed the area, and discovered security cameras in the vicinity. One of the cameras had captured something very interesting. An hour and a half before the shooting, a maroon Ford F-150 truck arrived in the area, parked, and a slim young man in a white shirt exited the vehicle. He didn't go directly to Barron's house, but he moved toward the area. After the shooting, the man reappeared, and the truck drove away. The police continued their search, reviewing additional footage from road cameras and businesses, eventually tracking the truck's license plate. But that was just the beginning. The investigation revealed 2 key things. First, the truck contained 2 individuals, the driver and the shooter, who was seated in the passenger seat. The shooter appeared young, wearing a white shirt, a gold chain, and a belt worn incorrectly, with only the waist strap in place. This detail would prove important. Second, the driver, a young, slender man, matched the description of the shooter. However, when the police traced the truck's ownership, they found a discrepancy. The registered owner didn't match the description of the driver. The owner was Arthur Mendez, a family man living in Mount Vernon, Washington. Physically, he didn't fit the description at all. It seemed like a match, but it was actually his 17-year-old son, Quincy Mendez, who fit the description. The police decided to keep him under surveillance 24/7. tracking his car while also visiting Sharon. When they knocked on her door, they told her they were investigating a crime in Bellevue. Her immediate response was to ask if something had happened to her ex-husband, if he was dead. She didn't ask about Eric, her son, who was also there, which raised suspicions. She quickly shifted the conversation, suggesting that many people hated Barron, possibly people from Las Vegas, and implied he might have been involved in some shady dealings. Since they didn't get anything useful, the police left. On July 15, 2020, the police, following Quincy Mendez, saw him get into his car with a young man wearing a gold chain who put on his seatbelt in a peculiar way, only securing it around his waist, not across his chest. The agents decided to investigate further. His name was Joseph G., also 17 years old, and it seemed he was a classmate of Quincy's. Joseph fit the description of the potential shooter, so the police obtained a search warrant for his electronic data. What they uncovered was undeniable evidence. Joseph had been searching for GPS trackers online, specifically one model. In fact, he had visited a website where he had been tracking a device. Armed with this information, the police searched Barron's car and found, under the vehicle, the tracker they were looking for. They removed it and checked the registration code. It was listed under Sharon Kelly's name. This tracker had been purchased in 2015 but wasn't activated until 2 weeks before the shooting, and it was deactivated 4 days afterward. The police then dug deeper into the boys' networks, contacts, emails, and found that Sharon had contacted Joseph, offering him $1,000 to kill her ex-husband. She provided him with all the necessary details, including the tracker. Joseph then asked Quincy to drive him to the location, assuring him that he wouldn't need to do anything but drive. Quincy agreed. You might be wondering how Sharon knew these boys. It turns out that Sharon had a younger brother who attended Mount Vernon High School, where Joseph and Quincy were friends. Sharon had manipulated the boys into committing the crime for her. Barron couldn't believe it. The boys were innocent. They had been used, manipulated. They were good kids with no criminal history, and they had made a terrible mistake. But Sharon was the mastermind behind everything. When the time came, Barron suggested that the boys receive the lightest sentences possible because he had forgiven them. They were young, had their whole lives ahead of them, and could learn from this experience. Barron, too, had made mistakes in his youth, but he moved forward. He hoped the boys would do the same. They made a horrible decision, but he didn't want it to define their lives. Still, they had to pay for what they had done. The sentences were as follows. Joseph G. was found guilty of attempted murder and illegal possession of a firearm and was sentenced to 12 years and 8 months in prison, while Quincy pled guilty to first-degree assault and was sentenced to 8 years and 10 months in prison. When the sentence was handed down, the young man apologized to everyone, Barron, his family, and his own, and then said the following: "I thank God every day for saving your life. I couldn't live with that guilt." Then came Sharon's turn. Her sentence shocked everyone. She was initially charged with first-degree attempted murder but ultimately pled guilty to a lesser charge, second-degree incitement to commit murder, which carried a maximum sentence of 13.75 years in prison. Many felt the sentence was utterly ridiculous. However, it's worth noting that she will never have access to the trust fund. Now, it's your turn. What do you think of the case? Do you believe all the sentences were truly fair? Well, guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you found the case as interesting as I did. If so, leave a like and a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the case. Do you think the boys are as guilty as Sharon? And now, see you in the next video. Bye.